Buckle up, everyone, because today we're diving into a world where birds are a hazard to aircraft. We're talking bird strikes at Kotoka International Airport. That's in Accra, Ghana. And you might think, birds, really? But trust me, when a bird and a speeding plane meet, it can be disastrous. Today we're looking at a study all about bird strike risk at KIA.
It really is intriguing, We think of birds as harmless, but near airports, they're a real challenge to keeping everyone safe.
Exactly. This isn't just a small problem. The cost of bird strikes is really shocking. In the U.S. alone, the aviation industry loses something like $1.2 to $1.5 billion every year because of bird strikes. So we need to understand this risk, and we have to figure out how to make it smaller. That's what this study tried to do. Where do we even begin with something like this?
Well, first we have to really define the problem. It's not just that there are birds near the airport. We have to know which types of birds are the riskiest for planes.
I see. So it's not just saying all birds are dangerous, is it?
You got it. The researchers knew they had to find a way to look at the danger from different birds. They had to think about all sorts of things that might lead to a bird strike.
That makes sense. A tiny sparrow isn't the same as a big hawk, especially if that hawk likes to hang out near the runway. So how did the researchers tell these different risks apart?
They made this cool thing called the Species-Specific Bird Strike Risk Index, or SSBR for short. This index looks at things like whether birds fly in flocks, how close they get to risky areas like the runway, if they do anything dangerous, and importantly, how big they are.
So it's like a danger scorecard for birds, helping researchers figure out which birds need the most attention. So it's not just what kind of bird it is, but also how it acts and where it hangs out near the airport. Did they just use this score to rank the birds, or did they actually study them more?
They used the SSBR as part of a bigger method. They watched and recorded what birds were doing all over the airport and nearby. They weren't just counting birds, they were mapping where they were and studying how they acted to get a good idea of the risk of bird strikes at KIA.
Okay, I'm really curious now about how they did all that. Imagine I'm a bird watcher suddenly in charge of airplane safety. What were the researchers actually doing?
Okay, so picture the airport and the area around it. They divided it all into 8 different zones. Each zone had a different risk level for bird strikes.
8 zones. That sounds pretty thorough. I bet the runway is the most dangerous, right?
Exactly. The runway is where planes are going the fastest, and they're really low to the ground. That makes hitting a bird extra dangerous. They called this the runway zone.
Makes sense. So what about the other 7 zones? Where are they on this bird risk map?
Well, around the runway is the taxiway zone. Planes are moving slower there, but they can still hit birds. Next to that is the middle strip zone. It's kind of a space between the runway and taxiways. Then there's the parking bay zone, where planes park or get worked on. And don't forget the in-flight zone. That's where planes come in to land.
So that's 5. Runway, taxiway, middle strip, parking bay, and in-flight. And the last 3, are we moving away from the airport now?
Right. The last 3 look at the areas around the airport. First, there's the inner perimeter zone. That's right next to the runway and taxiways. And then 2 landside zones, one within 500 meters of the airport and another further out.
Wow, they really thought of everything, from the middle of the airport to way outside the fences. But dividing things into zones is just the start, isn't it? What were the researchers actually doing in each zone?
They were watching and recording everything the birds were doing. They did this for a specific amount of time in each zone. They paid attention to how many birds there were, what kinds of birds, and importantly, how they acted, especially how fast they reacted when a plane came close.
So they weren't just counting birds, they were trying to understand how birds act around planes. That makes a lot of sense. They really wanted to understand the risk. So did they figure out the biggest troublemakers at KIA?
Oh, they did. Out of 86 bird species around KIA, they found a few that were the biggest risk to planes. They actually labeled 4 as critical risk and 4 more as high risk using those SSBR scores.
Wow, so they narrowed it down. Who were the worst offenders on this bird danger list?
The critical risk ones were the pied crow, the hooded vulture, the yellow-billed kite, and the cattle egret. And then for high risk, it was the lanner falcon, common kestrel, African wattled lapwing, and the double-spurred francolin.
Some of those I've heard of, but others are a bit of a surprise. The pied crow. Really, I wouldn't have thought of them as a big airport hazard. It's not like it's a big eagle or a huge vulture or anything.
That's true. The pied crow isn't exactly intimidating looking. But at KIA, they found a lot of them, especially in the riskiest areas, like right on the runway. That's why they're considered critical risk. They're everywhere, and they like to hang out where planes are taking off and landing.
I guess it really shows that it's not just the size of the bird that matters. It's also how they behave and where they like to be around the airport. A bunch of small birds on the runway could be just as bad as one big hawk flying around.
Absolutely. And the researchers were really focused on how these birds reacted to planes coming in. Some birds, even big ones, might not fly away when a plane is landing. That makes it more likely they'll get hit.
Okay, so let me get this straight. They made a map of the airport with the different risk zones, and then they carefully watched what the birds were doing in each zone. They looked at the type of bird, how many, and how they acted. That's incredibly detailed. Did they see any actual bird strikes while they were doing all this?
They did, and this is where it gets really interesting. A bunch of the bird strikes they saw during the study involved the same species they'd labeled as high risk. So it really proves that their risk assessment and that SSBR index worked. One example was a yellow-billed kite that was involved in 3 separate strikes.
Wow, 3 strikes. That's not just bad. Look, that kite had a problem. It just shows how important these risk assessments are. But knowing which birds are dangerous is only part of the solution, right?
Yeah.
We also need to know why KIA is such a popular spot for birds.
You're exactly right. It's super important to know the dangerous birds, but we also have to understand what attracts them to the airport in the first place. The researchers looked into this too, and they found a few key reasons why KIA is such a bird hotspot.
Okay, tell me, what is it about this airport that birds love so much?
Well, first of all, there are several landfills really close to the airport. Plus an abattoir, like a slaughterhouse. Those places are full of food for birds like pied crows and hooded vultures, which we already know are some of the biggest troublemakers.
So it's like putting a giant bird buffet next door to a busy airport. Not exactly a good way to keep the birds away, is it?
Not really, but it's not just the food. The airport also has a bunch of pools of water that attract birds, especially after it rains. And there's tons of grassy areas that are perfect for all kinds of birds, including some of the dangerous ones.
So lots of food, water, and places to live, all right next to the airport. Sounds pretty nice if you're a bird. It's like the airport is accidentally giving them everything they need. Did the researchers have any ideas about how to fix these problems? We can't just move the airport or get rid of all the food, water, and places for birds to live.
Yeah, it's a tough one. We need to keep planes safe, but airports are often built in areas where lots of animals live. Luckily, the researchers did have some ideas about how to manage the bird strike risk at KIA, and they focus on fixing the root causes we've been talking about.
Okay, I'm all ears. Did they say anything about using lasers or those sonic cannons to scare birds away? Or maybe building giant nets over the whole airport?
Nothing that dramatic. They said we need a more balanced approach, using things to stop birds from coming to the airport in the first place, and things to deal with them when they're already there.
I like the sound of a balanced approach. So what do they mean by things to stop birds from coming in the first place? How would that even work at an airport?
Well, for example, they suggested moving those landfills and the slaughterhouse further away from the airport. That would get rid of a major food source for birds like crows and vultures. Hopefully, fewer birds would hang around the runways.
Makes sense. Out of sight, out of mind. Or in this case, out of smell, out of beak. That seems like a good place to start. But what about the water and the grassy areas? We can't just drain all the water or pave over everything.
You're right, we might have to change some of the habitat around the airport, but it's all about finding the right balance. They recommended making targeted changes, like changing how the landscaping looks, controlling how much water is around, and maybe getting rid of tall trees that some of the risky birds like to perch and roost in.
So the goal isn't to get rid of all birds, but to manage them so they're not a danger to planes. It's about remembering that the airport is part of a bigger ecosystem.
Exactly. We want fewer birds at the airport, especially the risky ones. But just preventing them from coming isn't always enough. That's where we need ways to deal with them when they're already there.
Okay, so if preventing them from coming is the first step, what about dealing with them when they're already there? Are we talking about those loud sonic cannons you see at airports? I know some places even use trained falcons to chase birds away. Did the researchers talk about that?
They did mention those things, but they said we shouldn't just use one method all the time. Birds can get used to certain sounds or scary things, so it's important to mix it up to keep them guessing.
It's like a game of bird chess. We have to stay one step ahead. What else did they suggest?
Well, trained dogs can be really good at chasing birds away from runways and stuff. They can really disrupt things and get the birds to go somewhere else.
Like a canine air force. That's pretty cool. What about those fireworks I've seen at some airports? Do those actually work?
Yeah, those controlled bursts of light and sound can be good at scaring birds away. But just like anything else, you have to use them carefully and as part of a bigger plan. If you only use fireworks, the birds will just get used to them.
So we need to use different methods and be smart about it. Keep the birds away from the airport without hurting them.
Exactly. And the researchers also said it's important to keep watching and collecting data. Airports change, bird populations go up and down, and new things can attract them.
So it's not a one-time fix. It's something you have to keep working on.
Right. And that's where technology can be a big help. Besides the things we've already talked about, there are some really cool new tech solutions being developed. We'll talk about those in the next part of our deep dive.
I can't wait. Stay with us, everyone, while we learn about the latest in bird strike prevention. We'll be back after a short break. Okay, we're back, and we're talking high-tech bird deterrence. What kind of cool new tools are people making to deal with this?
Bird detection systems are really promising. They use things like radar, even AI, to spot birds flying around. So pilots and air traffic control get warnings.
Like an extra set of eyes just for birds. That seems super helpful when planes are taking off and landing.
Exactly. These systems show what birds are doing in real time, so we can react faster and in a more targeted way. Say a flock of birds is headed for the runway, air traffic control could delay a plane taking off, or they could change how a plane lands to avoid the birds.
It's amazing how technology can make things safer for both planes and birds.
You got it. It's all about coexistence. And the technology is just getting better. There's some really exciting things happening in this field.
What about lasers? I've heard about using those to scare birds. Are they being used anywhere?
Yeah, some airports are trying out lasers. These special lasers shine a light that birds don't like, so they fly away. The cool thing is, it doesn't hurt the birds. It just annoys them enough to go somewhere else.
That's awesome. Technology that helps us live safely with birds, it's not about fighting them. It's about finding ways to share the space.
Right. And even with all this, some bird strikes are probably going to happen. It makes you wonder, what happens when a bird hits a plane?
It's a scary thought. All that damage a bird could do to a plane going so fast.
Yeah, it's not something you want to think about, but the aviation industry takes it very seriously. How bad a bird strike is depends on a bunch of things. How big the bird is, how fast the plane is going, where the bird hits.
I bet it makes a big difference if it's a little bird hitting the windshield or a big bird getting sucked into the engine.
You're right. It can be anything from a little damage to a total disaster. Small birds usually hit the windshield or the front of the plane. It can cause some problems, but it's usually okay. Big birds, though, they can really mess things up. They can damage wings, engines, important parts of the plane.
That's not good. But it shows why it's so important to do everything we can to prevent bird strikes. So what happens when a bird does hit a plane?
The pilot has to tell air traffic control right away. Then they do a full investigation. They figure out how bad the damage is, if there are any safety issues, and they gather information to help stop it from happening again.
You said gather information. What kind of information do they get from a bird strike?
It might sound strange, but it's really important for understanding bird strikes. They need to know which birds are causing problems and where, so they can make those prevention strategies even better.
So they're not just cleaning up, they're learning from it. What do they actually look at?
They check the plane really carefully to see where the bird hit and how bad the damage is. They also collect any pieces of the bird they can find. They use that to figure out what kind of bird it was. Then they can track what birds are doing around the airport and see if there are any new problems.
So even though it's bad when a bird hits a plane, we can learn something from it and stop it from happening again.
Exactly. We're always learning. By studying bird strikes, we can make flying safer for everyone.
Wow, that's a lot to think about. I don't think I'll ever look at birds near the airport the same way again.
It's been great talking about this with you. And to our listener, think about what we've learned today. Next time you're at an airport, take a minute to think about everything that goes into keeping us safe in the air. It's complicated, but people are working hard to solve this problem. And they're doing it in a way that respects nature.
That's a good point. We're so used to flying that we forget how amazing it is. And it shows how smart we are and how we can find ways to live with other species. So next time you're flying, remember the birds up there with you. And remember all the work that's going into making sure everyone gets where they're going safely. Until next time, keep looking up and keep an eye out for those birds.